You are looking at the single most important substance on the planet: water. Every living thing needs it to survive. You can go weeks without food, but only about 3 days without water before your organs start shutting down. Today, you walk to a faucet, turn a handle, and clean, filtered water pours out. You probably do not even think about it. But for roughly 300,000 years of human existence, that luxury did not exist. There were no treatment plants, no pipes, no filters. Just rivers, lakes, ponds, and rain. And here is the part that makes this story so fascinating. The water that kept ancient humans alive was also the thing most likely to kill them. What nobody talks about is just how many of our ancestors died from something as simple as taking a drink. How does a species survive for hundreds of thousands of years when the one resource it cannot live without is also one of the deadliest things in its environment? That question is the key to understanding one of the most overlooked stories in human history. To grasp just how dangerous water was in the ancient world, you need to forget everything you know about the microscopic world. Ancient humans had no concept of bacteria. They could not see viruses. They did not understand parasites. When someone drank from a still pond near a settlement and got violently ill 2 days later, they had no framework to connect the water to the sickness. For all they knew, it was a curse, or bad air, or punishment from the gods. The real cause, microorganisms invisible to the naked eye, would not be understood for tens of thousands of years. And the diseases these organisms caused were absolutely devastating. Cholera could kill a healthy adult within hours through extreme dehydration. The body would lose fluids so rapidly that a person could go from perfectly fine to dead in under 12 hours. Dysentery, caused by bacteria like Shigella, created cycles of bloody diarrhea that weakened entire communities over weeks and months. Typhoid fever could spread through a single contaminated water source and flatten a village, moving from one household to the next as families shared the same river or well. Parasitic worms would take up residence in the human gut, slowly draining nutrients from their host over months or even years. A person could carry these parasites for an entire lifetime without ever understanding why they felt weak and tired, why their children grew slowly, why they could never quite shake the exhaustion that followed them from season to season. Archaeologists have examined ancient human remains from sites across Africa, Europe, and Asia, and the evidence is everywhere. Skeletal deformities from chronic malnutrition caused by parasites. Growth disruptions in children's bones that line up with waterborne illness. Calcified eggs from parasitic worms preserved in ancient latrines and burial sites. The numbers, when you try to estimate them, are staggering. Some researchers believe that before the development of any water purification methods, waterborne illness was responsible for more deaths than warfare, animal attacks, and starvation combined. Infants and young children were hit hardest. In many ancient populations, somewhere between 30 and 50% of children died before reaching the age of 5, and contaminated water was a leading driver. Think about that for a second. Nearly half the children born in some ancient communities never made it to their 5th birthday, in large part because of what they were drinking. So how did early humans even begin to figure this out? The answer starts not with intelligence, but with instinct. Our earliest ancestors, long before agriculture or permanent settlements, were nomadic. They moved constantly, following animal herds and seasonal food sources. This movement was itself a form of accidental water management. Nomadic groups rarely stayed near one water source long enough to heavily contaminate it with their own waste. They drank, they moved on, and the water had time to recover. It was not a strategy anyone designed. It was just how survival worked. But even within this nomadic lifestyle, early humans started developing preferences. They gravitated toward flowing water, streams and rivers moving over rocks, cascading down hillsides, fed by mountain snowmelt. They avoided stagnant pools where the water was discolored or had a strange smell. Places where algae formed a thick green skin across the surface and insects hovered in clouds. They watched animals closely. If a herd of deer drank from a particular stream each morning, that was a signal. If animals avoided a pond, If birds circled but never landed near a water source, humans learned to do the same. These were not scientific conclusions. They were patterns passed from parent to child over generations, refined by the consequences of getting it wrong. Grandmother drank from the fast-moving stream and stayed healthy. Uncle drank from the green pond near the dead trees and got sick. The family that settled near the clear spring on the hillside thrived. The group that camped beside the still marsh lost 3 children in one season. Over thousands of years, these observations became embedded cultural knowledge, passed down through oral tradition like a survival manual that nobody ever wrote down. Every tribe, every band of early humans carried this invisible library of accumulated wisdom in their stories and their habits. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because what happened next was not gradual. It was a crisis. Around 12,000 years ago, humans began settling down. The agricultural revolution changed everything. Instead of following food, people planted it. They built permanent villages near rivers and lakes. And for the first time, large groups of humans were living in one place, right next to their water supply, for years on end. The same rivers they drank from became the rivers they bathed in. The same streams they relied on for cooking flowed past the areas where they dumped waste. Human and animal waste seeped into groundwater. Settlements grew larger. The water got worse. And diseases that had been occasional threats to nomadic bands became constant killers of settled communities. This was the great paradox of early civilization. The stability that allowed humans to build villages, grow crops, and develop culture also created the conditions for epidemic waterborne illness. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers that nourished the first Mesopotamian cities also carried the waste of thousands of people downstream to the next settlement. The Nile, which made Egyptian agriculture possible, was simultaneously a highway for parasites. The Yellow River in ancient China, the Ganges in India, the Jordan in the Levant. Every great river that birthed a civilization also became a vector for disease as populations along its banks multiplied. Civilization and contamination grew hand in hand. The bigger the settlement, the worse the problem. And the communities that survived were the ones that started, slowly and through painful trial and error, figuring out how to make their water safer. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about how ancient water knowledge developed. The single most important discovery was also the simplest one: boiling. At some point, ancient humans noticed that water heated over a fire seemed safer to drink. Nobody knew why. Nobody understood that heat was killing microscopic organisms. But the correlation between boiled water and fewer sick people was strong enough to stick. In China, the practice of boiling water before drinking became culturally embedded thousands of years before anyone could explain the science. Ancient Chinese texts from as early as 1700 BCE reference the practice. Heated water was considered cleaner, purer, more harmonious with the body. The explanation was wrong, rooted in philosophy rather than microbiology, but the practice was exactly right. Boiling spread independently across multiple civilizations, which makes it one of the most remarkable examples of convergent discovery in human history. Evidence suggests that communities in South Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Africa all developed some version of this practice on their own, without any contact with each other. Wherever humans mastered fire and had access to clay or stone vessels that could hold water over a flame, boiling eventually emerged as a technique. The logic was simple, even without the science. Hot water from the fire seemed safer than cold water from the river. People who drank it got sick less often. That was enough. It was not universal, and it was not always consistent. Fuel for fires was precious, especially in arid regions where wood was scarce. Boiling every drop of drinking water was impractical for large populations. You cannot heat enough water for an entire village when you are also using your firewood for cooking, warmth, and tool-making. But for the most vulnerable members of a community, for infants and pregnant women, and the elderly and the already sick, boiled water became a recognized precaution in cultures separated by thousands of miles. Mothers across the ancient world, from the forests of Southeast Asia to the highlands of East Africa, learned to give their youngest children boiled water when possible, even if they did not understand why it helped. And boiling was just the beginning. Ancient people developed an entire toolkit of water purification methods, many of which would not be scientifically validated for thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians were among the first to use a crude form of chemical treatment. Records from around 1500 BCE describe a process called coagulation, where they added a substance, likely alum, to murky water. The alum caused suspended particles to clump together and settle to the bottom of the vessel. The Egyptians would then pour off the clearer water from the top. They did not understand the chemistry. They just knew that the treated water looked better and seemed to cause fewer problems. In ancient India, the Sanskrit medical texts, known as the Sushruta Samhita, written around 600 BCE, contain remarkably detailed instructions for water purification. These texts recommended filtering water through sand and coarse gravel. They described using the seeds of a tree called the Strychnos potatorum, which releases compounds that clarify water by binding to impurities. The texts even recommended exposing water to sunlight or heating it with hot copper. That last detail is particularly interesting because modern science has confirmed that copper surfaces kill bacteria through what is called the oligodynamic effect. Ancient Indian physicians stumbled onto a principle of microbiology thousands of years before microscopes existed. The Greeks contributed their own innovations. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, designed a device around 400 BCE that is now called the Hippocratic sleeve. It was essentially a cloth bag used to strain rainwater, removing sediment and some impurities. Hippocrates did not know about bacteria, but he observed that strained water seemed to produce fewer cases of illness. He also recommended boiling water for his patients, particularly those who were already sick. Meanwhile, Greek households commonly stored water in copper or brass vessels, a practice that, as we now understand, would have had genuine antibacterial properties. But the most ambitious water engineering project of the ancient world belonged to Rome. The Roman Empire built a network of aqueducts that stretched across hundreds of miles, carrying fresh water from mountain springs and clean rivers to cities with populations exceeding 1 million people. The engineering was extraordinary. Aqueducts used gravity to maintain constant water flow across valleys, through tunnels carved into mountains, and over massive stone archways that still stand today. At its peak, the city of Rome received an estimated 250 million gallons of water per day through 11 major aqueducts. The genius of the Roman system was not just the engineering, it was the sourcing and the design philosophy behind every decision. Roman engineers understood, through observation, if not science, that water from mountain springs was cleaner than water from lowland rivers. They deliberately chose source points at high elevations, far from human settlements and agricultural runoff. The water traveled through enclosed stone channels that protected it from contamination along the journey. These channels were covered with stone slabs or buried underground, specifically to keep out sunlight, animal waste, and debris. Settling tanks called piscinae at various points along the route allowed sediment to drop out naturally. Some aqueducts included multiple settling basins in sequence, each one catching finer and finer particles. By the time the water reached the fountains and bathhouses of Rome, it was remarkably clean by ancient standards. Roman officials called curatores aquarum were appointed specifically to maintain and protect the water supply, inspecting aqueducts for leaks, contamination, and illegal tapping. Water quality was not an afterthought in Rome. It was a matter of state policy. I mean, think about that for a second. A civilization with no knowledge of microbiology, no chemical testing, and no understanding of pathogens managed to build a water delivery system that kept a city of over 1 million people supplied with relatively safe drinking water. That is an engineering achievement that would not be matched for over 1,000 years after Rome fell. And the Romans were not alone in their ambition. Across the ancient world, other civilizations were solving the same problem with their own ingenuity. The Indus Valley Civilization, centered in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, built covered drainage systems and sophisticated wells as early as 2600 BCE. The city of Mohenjo-Daro had brick-lined wells in nearly every household and a complex network of covered drains that carried wastewater away from living areas and out of the city entirely. The drains were built with precisely fitted bricks and covered with stone slabs to prevent contamination of the streets and surrounding water sources. Some homes even had what appear to be private bathing rooms with dedicated drainage lines. This separation of clean water supply from waste disposal is exactly the principle that modern sanitation is built on. The Indus Valley people figured it out over 4,000 years ago and did it with a level of urban planning that some modern cities still struggle to match. If you are finding this useful, hit that subscribe button. We cover deep dives like this every week. So we have established that ancient civilizations were remarkably creative about water. But what came next made all of that engineering look like a warm-up, because there was another solution hiding in plain sight that ancient humans discovered almost by accident: fermentation. The process of turning grain or fruit into alcohol was one of the oldest and most widespread forms of accidental water purification in human history. When ancient Mesopotamians brewed beer around 7,000 years ago in the river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates, they were not thinking about water safety. They were making a drink that tasted good and made them feel relaxed. But the fermentation process, in which yeast converts sugars into alcohol, created an environment hostile to many waterborne pathogens. The alcohol content, combined with the acidity produced during fermentation, killed bacteria that would have thrived in untreated water. The result was that beer was often safer to drink than the river water it was made from. In ancient Egypt, beer was so central to daily life that it was used as currency. Workers building the pyramids at Giza received daily rations of bread and beer, not as luxury items, but as staple sustenance. The beer was thick, nutritious, and low in alcohol content compared to modern versions, roughly 2 to 3%. More like a fermented grain porridge than anything you would recognize as beer today. But it was safe, it was calories, and it kept the workforce alive and functional in a way that the local Nile water could not always guarantee. The Greeks and Romans took a different approach with the same underlying principle. They drank wine, often diluted with water. The practice of mixing wine into water was so common in ancient Greece that drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric. This was not snobbery. The alcohol and acidity in the wine helped neutralize some of the contaminants in the water. A Roman soldier marching across Gaul with a skin of wine, mixed water, was carrying a safer drink than the local streams he passed along the way. Nobody understood the microbiology. They just knew the wine-water mix caused fewer stomach problems than straight river water. This pattern repeated across cultures worldwide. In East Asia, the practice of brewing rice, wine, and various fermented grain drinks served the same function. In parts of Africa, communities developed fermented beverages from millet, sorghum, and honey. Each culture arrived at fermentation independently, and each one benefited from its accidental purification properties without understanding the mechanism. It was evolution by observation. The communities that drank fermented beverages got sick less often and grew larger. The ones that relied solely on untreated water suffered higher mortality rates. Over centuries, fermentation became culturally embedded, not because anyone proved it was safer, but because the populations that adopted it simply survived better. And then there was the role of pottery and clay vessels. This is the detail that everyone missed at the time, but modern science has confirmed. Many ancient cultures stored water in unglazed clay pots. These pots are porous, allowing tiny amounts of water to seep through the walls and evaporate on the surface. This evaporation cooled the water inside, which ancient people valued for the taste. But the clay itself was also acting as a crude filter. The microscopic pores in the earthenware trapped some bacteria, sediment, and particulate matter as water passed through or sat inside the vessel. Was it as effective as a modern water filter? Not even close. But in a world where every small reduction in pathogen load could mean the difference between life and death, especially for infants and the elderly, Clay pot storage provided a marginal but meaningful advantage. Some cultures took this further with deliberate engineering. In parts of ancient South America, communities lined their water storage vessels with specific types of clay known to have antimicrobial properties. In the Middle East, copper vessels were used alongside pottery, adding another layer of passive disinfection through the oligodynamic effect of the metal. In ancient Persia, large underground storage chambers called yakchuls kept water cool through evaporation and thermal mass, combining temperature control with the natural filtration of the earthen walls. These were not controlled experiments. Nobody ran studies or compared outcomes across test groups. But across thousands of years, the cultures that combined multiple methods, boiling when possible, storing in clay or copper, choosing water from flowing sources, adding fermented beverages to their diet, tended to have lower rates of waterborne illness than those that did none of these things. The evidence lay in population growth. The civilizations that mastered water, or came closest to mastering it, were the ones that grew largest and lasted longest. Now comes the part of this story that is genuinely frustrating, because after thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, after the Romans built aqueducts and the Indus Valley built covered drains, and Egyptian physicians recorded water treatment methods on papyrus, a lot of that knowledge was lost. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, the aqueduct system fell into disrepair. Medieval European cities grew up without anything resembling the water infrastructure that Rome had built 1,000 years earlier. Rivers that ran through London, Paris, and other major cities became open sewers. People dumped waste into the same waterways they drew drinking water from. The understanding that clean water sources needed to be separated from waste disposal, a principle the Indus Valley and Roman civilizations had grasped millennia ago, was largely forgotten. The results were predictable and devastating. Medieval Europe experienced repeated outbreaks of waterborne illness that killed thousands. Cholera epidemics swept through cities, turning entire neighborhoods into death zones within weeks. Dysentery was so common it was considered a normal part of life, just something people endured. The River Thames in London, which had once been a relatively clean waterway, became so polluted by the 19th century that Parliament could not meet in the summer because the stench from the water was unbearable. They called it the Great Stink of 1858. Infant mortality remained catastrophic throughout this period. In some European cities, roughly 1 in 4 babies died before their first birthday, and contaminated water was a primary cause. It would take until the 1800s, when scientists like John Snow traced a cholera outbreak in London to a contaminated water pump on Broad Street, for Western civilization to begin rediscovering what ancient peoples had known through observation. Clean water and waste disposal must be kept separate. Water from certain sources is safer than water from others. Treatment of water before drinking reduces illness. And if you want to know how far the world had regressed, consider this. In 1854, when John Snow was making his breakthrough, the city of London still did not have a water system that matched what Rome had possessed in 100 AD. 18 centuries of progress, and the greatest city in the world at the time had actually gone backwards on water safety. That is the kind of fact that makes you look at ancient civilizations with completely different eyes. The real lesson of this entire story is not that ancient humans were primitive and lucky. It is the opposite. They were observant, adaptive, and creative in ways that we consistently underestimate. They could not see bacteria. They did not have germ theory. They lacked every tool that modern scientists take for granted. But they watched, they remembered, they shared knowledge across generations, and they experimented through the most ruthless testing environment imaginable, survival itself. The methods that worked kept people alive long enough to pass those methods on. The methods that failed killed their practitioners. Over tens of thousands of years, this process of observation and selection produced a body of water knowledge that was remarkably sophisticated. Ancient Indian physicians recommended copper vessels and sunlight exposure. Modern science confirms both methods kill bacteria. Egyptian engineers developed coagulation techniques using natural compounds. Modern water treatment plants use the exact same principle with updated chemicals. Chinese communities boiled their drinking water as a cultural practice thousands of years before Louis Pasteur proved that heat kills microorganisms. Boiling remains one of the most effective water purification methods known to science. Roman engineers sourced water from high-elevation springs and transported it through enclosed stone channels to cities below. Modern water utilities do precisely the same thing with updated materials. These ancient peoples did not have the vocabulary to explain why their methods worked. They could not draw a diagram of a bacterium or explain the mechanism of infection, but they got the answers right. Over and over again, across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, they converged on the same basic truths about water safety through nothing more than careful observation and hard-won experience passed down from one generation to the next. The real question is not how ancient humans survived without clean water. They clearly had more sophisticated approaches than we give them credit for. The deeper question is, what else did they know that we have not yet rediscovered? What other accumulated wisdom about medicine, agriculture, materials, and the natural world was lost in the centuries between the fall of ancient empires and the rise of modern science? Consider this. There are still billions of people on the planet today who lack access to reliably clean drinking water. The World Health Organization estimates that contaminated water causes over 400,000 deaths every year, many of them children under the age of 5. Some of the most effective low-cost solutions being deployed in the developing world right now, ceramic pot filters, solar disinfection, copper treatment, are essentially refined versions of techniques that ancient civilizations used thousands of years ago. We are not inventing new solutions. We are rediscovering old ones. And what might we still be missing today? Drinking our filtered tap water, assuming we have all the answers, just like every civilization before us assumed the same thing. If this changed the way you think about our ancestors, drop a like and leave a comment telling us which ancient water method surprised you the most. And if you want more deep dives into the hidden brilliance of the ancient world, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one.